Chapter 18, Deja Vu all over again. History has recorded well the actual events of 1944 and early 1945, but I was imprisoned while they were occurring, so even though we all sensed it was only a matter of time before the war ended, we are not fully aware that the sweeping changes in the Axis situation would soon determine the outcome of the conflict. Italy had been defeated. Britain had survived the Blitzkrieg. Hitler's blundering assault on Russia had failed. D-Day, which would establish the United States as a fighting machine, had marked the beginning of the end for Hitler. Scientists in Los Alamos was readying atomic weapons called Fat Man and Little Boy to be used on the unsuspecting Japanese population of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which went about its business unaware of what was happening, as I was. And so I was unwittingly thrust into the middle of another historic event, even though this one is far less well known than Casablanca Summit, where I went to see Roosevelt and Churchill in 1943. It was no less monumental to the men who lived and died during this forced march. It was called the Black March, the Bread March, or more commonly, the Shoe Leather Express. Whatever its name, it was the second worst death march in American military history. The worst atrocity of that kind was generally considered to be the 1942 Bataan Death March, where hundreds of Americans and thousands of Filipino soldiers died as Japanese troops forced them to march 60 miles across the Bataan Peninsula in the jungle temperatures without food or water. All but forgotten by historians until precipitants came forward decades later to chronicle the march. The journey I experienced occurred in early February to mid-April 1945. During 3 months of one of the worst German winters ever recorded, it involved thousands of GIs and was one of the cruelest, most unnecessary atrocities ever perpetrated by one group of human beings upon another. But here I go again, getting ahead of myself in the story. By late January 1945, we heard artillery fire in the distance. Our guards became irritable and jumpy. The Russians were coming. Perhaps they knew what we only suspected. Germany was surrounded. The Russians approached from the east and the Allies from the west and south. Berlin itself was under attack. Then, like a bolt out of the blue, there was a prison exchange in early February. Sick and wounded prisoners like Gary Robach, whom I mentioned in the earlier chapter, got to go home, but my injury had healed enough that I missed out on the trade. By the middle of February, we could tell from the sound of the artillery that the Russian army was closing in. In the camp, it was obvious from the guards' behavior that the Roxys were hot in pursuit of Hitler's army, in full retreat mode now. The Germans couldn't just let us go, so they decided that they would become part of their re-entrenchment. Thousands of POWs were evacuated by the Germans, many forced to walk up to 600 miles south and west through snowy, frigid, and unforgiving terrain. As one of Stalag IAB's POWs, I had missed out on the prisoner exchange. Now I had just what can only be called another ironic twist of fate. By the time our guards began emptying and closing down the stalag, my health had deteriorated so bad that I could scarcely get out of bed. I was surely one of the sickest puppies in the camp with potential lethal combination of diseases: dehydration, dysentery, and hepatitis, a life-threatening liver disease. Malnutrition, overcrowding, and poor sanitation were the causes, and the symptoms were horrible: weakness, fever, chills, constant diarrhea, yellow jaundice. Yet being so gravely ill probably saved my life. Due to my critical medical condition, I was one of the first to leave, fortunate to hitch a ride aboard a troop train commandeered by a POW evacuation. As they loaded us into boxcars to send us back behind the lines, I openly remarked to a buddy, "We should feel grateful for our good fortune." I spoke too soon. Pulled out by a smoke-belching steam locomotive that had seen its better days, the cars were filthy, drafty, and stunk to high heaven. There was no sanitation and no food. Just like the train that had brought me to Hammerstein, as Yogi Berra was supposed to have said it was déjà vu all over again. Still, I'm not sure that if I had not been able to ride most of the 500-plus miles to Hanover, I probably would never have made it there alive. Just as it had been on the Hell train into the prison camp, there was unimaginable suffering on board the retreat train, and now many of the German guards dropped their pretense of humanitarian treatment. Sometimes the engineer parked the train in the middle of nowhere just to let the troop cars sit. We never knew why. They might have run out of fuel or needed the guards to fight, but it meant we were sitting ducks for the barrage of the Allied bombs dropping by pilots who did not know what the trains carried. No enemy soldiers or war materials, but their countrymen. We quickly devised a system where men took turns listening for incoming planes so so at their approach, those who were able could scatter into the countryside to find available cover. I was too sick to move, so I just covered my head and prayed. I had a number of very close calls, and many men were again killed by friendly fire. When we weren't dodging bombs or marooning in some godforsaken sidetrack, the procession of boxcars made it slowly south and west. The weather was freezing cold, and if a man died during the trip, the body was just thrown out to make room for another sick and wounded man we picked up along the way. Of course, the train became so overcrowded that men again squeezed together as they had on the Hell train over a year before. As I said before, there's nothing to eat and only occasional drink of foul-tasting water, usually procured from an open-air cistern located alongside the road stations where we took our fuel. At night, the train stopped, generally in a small town that had escaped the brunt of the war's destruction. Here, the crew and the guards took the opportunity to rest and refresh themselves, but of course, we were not invited. Instead, we were ordered out of the cars and herded, or in my case, carried into barns or other similar structures, if there were any nearby. Sometimes there was straw to sleep on. Sometimes the Germans refused to clean up clean straw, saying that we could contaminate it, and the livestock couldn't use it after we did. Again, I saw men crowded together so tightly that they could not lay down, forced to sleep standing. Many mornings I saw dead bodies of my less fortunate comrades being carried from the barn to who knows where, perhaps just thrown out into the snow because any kind of decent burial was impossible. On the unfortunate occasions when no shelter was available, we Volkovac camped in frozen fields or nearby forests, and lucky ones finding shelter under branches of evergreen trees. There, if a man died during the night, he was simply left, his blanket or coat commandeered by someone who needed it. His clothes searched for valuables or mementos. Such personal effects, and his dog tags, of course, were stuffed into the pockets of a buddy who did not know if he would ever make it home to tell his friends' loved ones what had happened. How I survived the preservation of that trip, only God can tell. I know if my buddies hadn't seen my need, I would have died for sure. They brought me water, which, while often contaminated, was usually available at night. But then there was next to nothing to eat. Sometimes a potato or kohlrabi would turn up, and then we'd scrouge for fuel to light a fire and cook it. Sharing the little that I had with me, I was done in Italy the day they visited many garbage cans in search of something edible. Meat was almost an unheard of luxury. Once in a while, a chicken, goose, or rabbit would find its way to a cooking pot. But more often than not, it was the farmer's cat or dog. I know that some men resorted to stealing the feed that they've been throwing the pigs, some to grazing cattle on grass, and some were driven to eat uncooked rats. Like I said earlier, there's nothing a man won't eat when he's starving. Well,